All right, so this is our special topics on research ethics number 3, a framework for making decisions on ethics related issues in research. We talked about historical documents yesterday. We haven't quite finished the topic yet. We did not actually cover the Bauman report, but that's okay. We'll come back to that later. So far, we've been talking about making ethical decisions or research ethics or making decisions on ethics related issues in research. But what exactly is ethics? Simply stated, ethics refer to standards of behaviors, and those standards will tell us how humans ought to act in the situations where they find themselves as friends, as parents, children, citizens, business people, teachers, professionals, in our context, researchers or graduate students. It helps us to clarify the meaning of ethics by knowing what ethics is not. First of all, ethics is not equivalent to feelings. This because some people, for whatever reason, they actually feel pretty good when doing bad things. Well, we'll not be naming names here, but you can think of easily examples in history or in contemporary world where people at least don't feel bad when doing things that actually is wrong. And for some interesting reasons that we're not going to hear, some people ethics is not equivalent to feelings also because sometimes we feel we're not feeling actually very good when we're supposed to do something that's right. Um, well, as sort of a example, not quite the best example, the reason that many of us, including me, have a difficult time reducing weight is because reducing weight actually does not feel very good. You can't eat too much, you can't eat things that you normally would like to eat, and you have to put a lot of effort into exercise. Those activities don't feel good. So that sort of gives us an example of, why we don't really feel very good when we're compelled to do something that's actually correct. Ethics is also not religion. First of all, well, the reason that ethics is not religion is because many people are not religious. But ethics applies to everyone, right? So even though you're not religious, you're supposed to abide to certain ethical standards. The second reason that ethics is not religion is that many religions advocate high ethical standards, but those religions do not necessarily address all the problems that we face. So for these two reasons, ethics is not religion. Ethics is also not the law, or more precisely, ethics is not following the law. A good system of law does incorporate many ethical standards, but the law can actually deviate from what is ethical. The law can become ethically corrupt, as some totalitarian regimes have made it. The law can also be a function of power alone and designed to serve the interests of narrow groups, right? For these reasons, the law can be ethically corrupt. The law may also have a difficult time designing or enforcing standards in some important areas, and may be slow to address new ethical problems. For example, cloning, that's a tough legal tussle for many years. Even though now biological science has made great advance or headway into cloning animals, in some cases human embryos, but the law or ethics and the law are still catching up. Ethics also is not following culturally accepted norms. Um, some cultures are quite ethical, but others can become corrupt, or at least they're blind to certain ethical concerns. Um, at least, at some point of history, for example, not just the USA, but many other countries have the system or had the system of, slavery, which of course, by today's standards, is not ethical at all. Um, in a sense, or in an ideal sense, we want ethics to be universal. That is, no matter where we go, as long as we can find human beings, we want the same sets of ethical rules to be applied there. But cultural norms obviously are local, right? They're culturally specific. So in this sense, when in Rome, do as the Romans do is actually not a satisfactory ethical standard. Lastly, ethics is not science. This is a big distinction to be made. And this because social and natural sciences can provide important data to help us make better ethical choices and ethical decisions, but science alone does not tell us what we ought to do, right? Science describes, but it does not prescribe. So science may provide an explanation for what humans are like, but ethics provides reasons for how humans ought to act. Also, just because something is scientifically or technologically possible, it may not be ethical to do it. Right? Again, we have the big issue, excuse me, of human cloning, and nowadays AI is a big deal. But whether or not we should allow computers to rule humans, that may become a big ethical debate in the near future. Um, exactly because ethics is so unique, right? Being different from feelings, religion, the law, cultural norms, and science, identifying ethical standards is actually very difficult. And there are actually two questions we need to ask ourselves and others when we're trying to tell others or ourselves whether or not we're behaving ethically or not. The first one is, what is the base of ethical standards? And second, if at all we can identify those ethical standards, how to apply those standards, right? So these are the two very important topics or questions we need to ask ourselves. It turns out that philosophers and social scientists have sort of enabled us to identify or answer these two questions by drawing on several sources of ethical standards. And we'll discuss these 5 sources of ethical standards one by one. The first one is the utilitarian approach. The second is the rights approach. Third is the fairness or justice approach. Fourth is the common good approach. And lastly, we have the virtual approach. Okay, so let's start with the utilitarian approach. Some philosophers or experts in ethics emphasize that the ethical action, according to the utilitarian approach, is the one that provides the most good or does the least harm. In other words, an ethical action or behavior should produce the greatest balance of good over the harm. For example, or to elaborate on this principle, right, then the ethical action should be the one that produces the greatest good and does the least harm for all those people who are affected. In this case, it will be research participants. An example in a larger context will be the war on terrorism. You might think that the war on terrorism is ethically justifiable, but you have to think every war, even war on terrorism, will entail collateral damage. So on one hand, we have the benefits of the war on terrorism. On the other hand, we have the costs or harms that will be done or have been done by a war of terrorism. So how do we balance or how do we weigh the good and the harm? In this sense, the utilitarian approach is essentially consequence oriented. In other words, it deals with consequences. It doesn't care about, well, I shouldn't say it doesn't care about, but it really is. It does not put too much emphasis on the course of action, but it does look at the results of the actions, whether or not it's good or harm, and how much good is weighed against how much harm. So in this sense, the utilitarian approach is consequentialist. Now we have the rights approach. According to this approach, ethical action is the one that best protects and respects the moral rights of those affected. And this approach starts from the belief that humans have a dignity based on their human nature per se, or on the ability to choose freely what they want to do with their lives. So, on the basis of such dignity, people, or humans, have a right to be treated as ends and not merely as means to other ends. So, in the context of our class, the rights approach dictates that we should not treat human subjects as the ways to gain data, but we should treat human subjects as humans, right? So those are the ends. If we treat human subjects merely as means to other ends, then we'll be treating them as sources of data, right? And that, according to the rights approach, is not right. It's wrong, ethically wrong. Then this approach also describes several basic human rights, starting with the right to make one's own choices, also the right to be told the truth, the right not to be injured or harmed, the right to a degree of privacy, and so on. Next, we have the fairness or justice approach. This approach started very early on with Aristotle and other Greek philosophers. They have contributed the idea that all people should be treated as equals. And because all people are created equal, and they should be treated equally. So today, we use this idea to say that ethical actions should treat all human beings equally, or if unequally, then ethical actions should, should treat people fairly based on some standard that is defensible. For example, we pay people more based on their harder work or the greater amount that they contribute to an organization, and we'll say that that is fair. Right? So the differential pay, in other words, obviously is not equal, but in a sense they may be fair. The fourth approach, or I should say, the fourth approach is the common good approach. So the Greek philosophers have also contributed to the notion that life in community is a good in itself, and our actions should contribute to that life. This approach suggests that the interlocking relationships of society are the basis of ethical reasoning, and that respect and compassion for all other people, especially the vulnerable, are requirements of such reasoning. This approach also calls attention to the common conditions that are important to the welfare of everyone. The welfare could be a system of laws, effective police and fire departments, healthcare, a public educational system, or even public recreational areas, right? Lastly, we have the virtual approach. This is very ancient, very old. So this very ancient approach to ethics says that ethical actions ought to be consistent with certain ideal virtues that provide for the full development of our humanity. These virtues are essentially dispositions and habits that would enable us to act according to the highest potential of our character and on behalf of values like truth and beauty. So examples of virtues include honesty, courage, compassion, generosity, tolerance, love, fidelity, integrity, fairness, self-control, and prudence. So essentially, virtual ethics asks of any action, what kind of person will I become if I do this? Or is this action consistent with my acting at my best? So these 5 approaches obviously are very different, will have very different philosophical underpinnings. Obviously, they can be applied to different situations, but the question will arise, when we try to put all these different 5 approaches into one single context. In this case, the context will be conducting social scientific research. So we should remember, though, that all approaches are helpful, right? But researchers, may not agree on the content of some of the approaches. For example, we may not all agree to the same set of human rights, right? We might agree that some are basic human rights, but others are not, depending on, of course, our cultural background, education we receive, and the kind of person we are. We may also not agree on what constitutes the common good, right? Is Is welfare system really a common good? Or we should actually not design a welfare system at all? And also, we may not agree on what is good and what is harm. Some researchers would think that the whole ethics is useless because it impedes scientific progress, right? They're thinking, of course, we're not be harming subjects intentionally, but sometimes, too much ethical concerns will prevent scientists doing really ingenious research that will greatly advance our knowledge. So they will consider, scientific advancement or progress is the greater good, and some suffering on human subjects is harm that's justifiable, right? So whether or not that's acceptable, of course, is actually, covertly debated among many researchers. Um, but of course, that's why we need ethical standards that are explicitly laid out in a handbook that we can hold people accountable to, right? Um, the second thing we should pay attention to when we're trying to integrate the 5 approaches um, to solve a single ethical problem is that the 5 approaches answer the question, what is ethical, differently. Sometimes the difference can be rather dramatic, that we need to be very cautious when applying each of those or some of those approaches. So exactly how we can apply each of the 5 approaches to answer the question, what is ethical, will be the topic for our next special topics on ethics. Okay, we'll end here today and continue tomorrow. All right, see you next time.